Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil 2 OG, Claire A scenario, normal difficulty, no damage walkthrough. This will cover the entire game in one single video, and I do want to mention that when I say no damage, I mean specifically for Claire, because I did take damage as Sherry because I got damaged by the cockroaches, but I really don't care about that. And also, this is the PS3 version of Resident Evil 2 OG, which is emulating the PS1 version, and this is the US version, by the way, not the Japanese version. But at the start, just follow what I'm doing, take out these zombies, and try to run past them. And right here is really annoying, because this female zombie is completely random. Sometimes she'll lunge at you, other times she won't. And this male zombie is also random as well, because there's no telling if he's going to move slowly or fast. That is a very random part, and it's really obnoxious. I believe in the Japanese version that male zombie isn't actually there, and there are far fewer zombies in certain rooms. I'm not entirely sure why the US version and the Japanese versions are so different. Like, which version was actually made first? That's a little puzzling. It's something I'll need to talk about when I do my Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective. And you heard me right, guys. I said Resident Evil 2 Remake, not Resident Evil 2 Remilk. There are a couple of reasons for this. Replaying Resident Evil 2 OG after a very long time, after I finally did my Resident Evil 4 Remilk retrospective, I can definitely say confidently that Resident Evil 2 OG really isn't that good of a game. I think it's massively overrated. It's a pretty dull, basic, and simple experience with some rudimentary gameplay, and the gameplay doesn't really try to be more than just simple rote memorization. It's just memorizing paths, finding the one linear path that gets you through areas in an optimized manner, and you're just running past enemies, and occasionally you're shooting them, but you're not really running past the enemies because they're supposedly scary or they're lethal or you're trying to save ammo. You're running past them because it's rather tedious trying to deal with them, and you'd rather just save your ammo to speed up any forced encounters later on, like with certain bosses. And I do have to give the developers credit for at least giving very specific ammunition types before bosses. Like, when you're playing as Claire and you're dealing with either G1 Birkin or the G Adult, the game always gives you 6 acid rounds before their encounters, and it really helps out because they die in 6 acid rounds. So it's nice that they let you do that, and it's good as well because those bosses could be horrendous. So to correct myself, it's like they gave those specific ammunition types just to speed up bad encounters because, of course, the limitations provided by the PS1 and the awkward development of Resident Evil 2 OG led to certain problems getting through, and G4 Birkin is the worst boss of Resident Evil 2 OG in so many ways. He is incredibly broken. If you don't use a specific exploit against G4 Birkin, you are going to get fucked royally by how badly designed he is. I mean it, guys, and even Ether agrees. Ether said that G4 Birkin is just as bad as Alexia from Code Veronica, and he is entirely correct. And I have to give a massive thanks to Ether for showing me that exploit to deal with G4 Birkin. You have absolutely no idea how broken he is, and I have to get a lot of G4 Birkin footage from my Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective, because G4 Birkin was designed by morons. It doesn't matter that this game released on very limited hardware. The fact that they designed G4 Birkin the way he is, and he's that broken, that is independent of any hardware limitations. But having mentioned my Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective, in case you're wondering what the progress is, I haven't really started the script. I've just been putting bullet points. I have like 6 pages worth of bullet points. There are a couple of reasons for this. So for one thing, I've been very busy professionally with certain things, but also I've completely underestimated how difficult making a Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective is when factoring in Resident Evil 2 OG. And with these recent playthroughs of Resident Evil 2 OG shining light on the many flaws present with its story, characters, environments, and gameplay, it's made making comparisons between Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake a bit more challenging. I mean, to all the people who said that Resident Evil 2 OG didn't need a remake, I just have to ask, what are you guys talking about? Resident Evil 2 OG definitely needed a remake because there are so many ports of Resident Evil 2 OG. It has a lot of clunky gameplay, a lot of bad bosses, awkward acting, weird screenplay, and a lot of optimization issues. And you really notice the optimization being poor on the PS3 version because, of course, it's emulating the PS1 version, and the PS1 version really makes the fixed camera angles obnoxious to deal with because every time you transition between the fixed cameras, the game always freezes. And this can be a big factor to consider when you're dealing with G2 Birkin, because backing up to avoid G2 Birkin's attacks is important, but every time I swap between the camera angles, it delays my input ever so slightly to allow him to get close to me and potentially hit me. So I'm having to slow myself down a lot when it comes to G2 Birkin. And also, this room right here is really obnoxious. I slowed it down briefly, but you have to turn a bit, and then you have to run in order to get around these zombies. So you have to pick that up, and then the detection on this door is horrendous. You have to go all the way to the left of the door in order for the detection to register. And then this part right here, if Marvin is moving fast and you're in caution health, you won't be able to back up quickly enough to avoid Marvin. You have to be in the fine health in order to back up quickly, turn around, and avoid Marvin. It's really dumb, but of course, it doesn't matter in my case because I'm not taking any damage. But back to what I was saying, Resident Evil 2 OG definitely needed a remake. I mean, there are so many ports to Resident Evil 2 OG. You have the original PlayStation 1 version, you have the PC version, you have the N64 version, you have the Dreamcast version, you have the GameCube version, you have the Gamecom version, and I don't even know if I've listed all the ports for Resident Evil 2 OG, and each of these ports have unique features associated with them. Like, for instance, in the Dreamcast and PC versions, they have access to a higher difficulty above normal difficulty called Nightmare difficulty, which is a very lazy difficulty. It's basically all the enemies have high health and you have less ammo. That's really it. But all the strategies you used on normal difficulty are easily applicable to Nightmare difficulty, so it's a pretty lazy difficulty. It's just scaling enemy health up and limited ammo. I mean, that's about as lazy as you can get. And I can't imagine a development team envisioning Nightmare difficulty to be just normal difficulty, but you're taking even longer to deal with enemies and bosses. Like, I'm gonna be spending an even longer time doing that one exploit against G4 Birkin, for instance, because of how incredibly broken he is. Like, how does that equate to good difficulty design? It just makes no sense at all. But getting back to the topic of ports, on the N64 version, you also gain access to additional story files that bridge Resident Evil 2 OG to future Resident Evil titles like Resident Evil 3 OG and Resident Evil Code Veronica X. And you also gain access to an alternate movement style that's similar to the alternate movement style you get in Resident Evil 1 Remastered and Resident Evil 0 Remastered. And it's such a confusing decision-making process. So for one port in Resident Evil 2 OG, they omitted tank controls and allowed you to swap to a very fluid movement style seen in more modern games. And yet they reverted back to the tank control format for Resident Evil 3 OG, Resident Evil 4 OG, Resident Evil 5, and similar Resident Evil titles that have tank control-based movements after Resident Evil 2 OG. Like, how does that work? That makes absolutely no sense. How do you favor an alternate movement style one time in 1998, and then it's not until 2012, I believe, with the release of Resident Evil Revelations, that they started to move away from the tank control-based system? Like, it just makes no sense how that works. And I've heard in an article that apparently the N64 controller doesn't have the best analog stick, and there are also some weird, like, issues with the alternate movement style in Resident Evil 2 OG, but regardless, the fact that they even considered putting it in there one time is mind-boggling to say the least, and that summarizes the differences between the ports of Resident Evil 2 OG, but that's not including the differences between the US and Japanese versions of Resident Evil 2 OG. The differences between the US and Japanese versions of Resident Evil 2 OG are vast. Like, the Japanese version, there are less enemies in certain hallways, and also, you get more ammo on the Japanese version. Like, for instance, there are pistol drops on the Japanese version that you will not see in the US version. So, all of these factors together with the differences between the ports and the differences between the localizations make it impossible to narrow down what exactly the genuine uniform experience of Resident Evil 2 OG is. This is one of the major reasons why Resident Evil 2 OG needed a remake in order to get the genuine experience the developers wanted. Because as it stands, I myself can't even identify what the genuine experience of Resident Evil 2 OG is supposed to be. And because of this is presenting as one of the main difficulties with talking about Resident Evil 2 OG in my Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective. It really feels like Resident Evil 2 OG is a victim of bizarre game development, as game development during the 90s and also during the early 2000s was really weird. It wasn't just because of hardware limitations at the time, but also because developers had weird mentalities when approaching game design. Take, for instance, how the storytelling is handled in Resident Evil 2 OG. You have Leon A connecting to Claire B, and you have Claire A linking to Leon B. On paper, this sounds like some kind of intentional idea, but it really doesn't feel like that to me. It feels like the reason why they put in the 4 scenarios in Resident Evil 2 OG was because they were trying to respond to hardware limitations at the time, rather than for any story reason. Almost like how Resident Evil Code Veronica X had to be split between 2 discs originally. It sounds on par with seeing a huge crack in the wall, but instead of fixing it, the developers opted to paint over it or incorporate the crack into art. That's what I think of when seeing the scenario design in Resident Evil 2 OG. It just feels like they designed the scenarios the way they did because of circumstances at the time, rather than for a logical reason. It's almost like they saw Resident Evil 2 OG wasn't long enough, and so to make it longer and to account for the hardware limitations at the time, they had to put in the scenario designs, and it can lead to people getting confused about the canon events of Resident Evil 2 OG. Like, people say that Claire A, Leon B is the canon storyline in Resident Evil 2 OG, and while it is true to a certain extent, and it's a much better storyline compared to Leon A, Claire B, there are moments where the later Resident Evil media clashes with this idea. Like in Resident Evil Degeneration, there's a moment where we see Claire confronting G1 Birkin, but Claire only confronts G1 Birkin in Claire B, not Claire A. And also, I believe there is supplementary material that says that Leon met Robert Kendo, but Leon only meets Kendo in the A scenario, not the B scenario. So again, like, you can't just say that Claire A, Leon B is the canon timeline. There are also other events from Leon A and Claire B you have to consider. Like, again, the scenario design just feels like it's here in Resident Evil 2 OG just because of circumstances at the time, and not because it feels like it was an intended design choice by the developers. So new Capcom could have used that as motivation to refine the storytelling of Resident Evil 2 Remake by favoring a Leon campaign and a Claire campaign, but instead they just reverted back to the same 4 scenario design, and they made it worse because of the fact that the 4 scenarios in Resident Evil 2 Remake just feel like 4 timelines rather than 2 connected timelines. And based on the fact that Marvin is shown in the intro to Resident Evil 4 Remake, it stands to reason that the only canon scenario from Resident Evil 2 Remake is Leon 1. So it really casts a lampshade over the confusing decision to have 4 scenarios in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and this idea of connected campaigns only got better in games like Resident Evil 6 and Resident Evil Revelations 2. And that's really something I have to say in my retrospective. It just feels like a lot of these older Resident Evil titles, they just feel like products that were released to give the developers more motivation to improve their later Resident Evil titles. So again, Resident Evil 2 OG definitely needed a remake. It just sucks that the remake of Resident Evil 2 is a pretty dull experience, but it's actually a lot more polished and more refined on the gameplay side and also with its environments. And because Resident Evil 2 OG is a pretty simple and dull experience, that sort of experience was going to get translated over to Resident Evil 2 Remake. And of course, the story in Resident Evil 2 OG is a lot better than in Resident Evil 2 Remake, and the characters, while they are weirdly voice acted in Resident Evil 2 OG, and at times their dialogue doesn't really make sense in the moment, they definitely feel better as characters compared to Resident Evil 2 Remake. So the general summary for Resident Evil 2 OG is that the story and characters are better than the remakes, but the gameplay, the bosses, it's not comparable to the remake. Whereas in the remake, it's the opposite, where the gameplay, the environments, the bosses, they're definitely more realized and more polished compared to Resident Evil 2 OG, but the other aspects are not as strong as Resident Evil 2 OG's. I mean, that's the summary I'm saying right now, but maybe that'll change when I do a deep dive on Resident Evil 2 OG and Resident Evil 2 Remake for the retrospective. But right now, I've not been talking much about the gameplay. There really hasn't been a point to doing commentary to explain the gameplay because it's all been very simple and very basic. But I'm taking a knife with me, and I'm going to use it against G2 Birkin. And G2 Birkin is pretty obnoxious, at least on the PS1 version, because of the fact that every time the camera changes, it stutters your input for a second, so that can give him the chance to close in on you if you happen to let go of the D-pad at the wrong moment. And also, I have to say this about the D-pad. I don't know if it's a problem with my controller or this is just a general thing that happens when you're using the D-pad for Resident Evil 2 OG. But do you know the amount of times I hold left or right on the D-pad and for some reason the character walks forward or walks backwards? I don't know why that happens with the D-pad on these older Resident Evil titles. And I don't recall this being a thing in Resident Evil Code Veronica X. I believe in Resident Evil 1 OG this was an issue where for some reason even when you were holding left or right on the D-pad it would misinterpret your input as like up or down on the D-pad because of the way the game reads the D-pad. It's just really bizarre, and the number of times I was getting screwed by that issue in Resident Evil 2 OG when I was practicing, really annoying. And also, right there, you see how the camera was shifting and it's pausing the game? So like if I let go of down on the D-pad at the wrong moment, this can cause Claire to not go back enough, and this can give G2 Birkin the chance to hit me, and that was getting me screwed a couple of times. And also, picking your position is very important when you're trying to hit G2 Birkin's left leg. The left leg is what you need to specifically hit when you're you're trying to bait out his slashes. And also, I don't know why, but there are times where even when I'm doing the method as I'm doing it right now, G2 Birkin can do a second slash as part of a combo. I don't know if that's just because I was close to him or I knifed at the wrong moment. It's just really confusing. I'm not really sure why that happens. But regardless, just do it. There's no reason not to use your knife against G2 Birkin. And honestly, guys, the thing with these older Resident Evil games is that there are so many knife-only players in Resident Evil 1 OG, Resident Evil 2 OG, and Resident Evil 3 OG that it just kind of puts pressure on you to use the knife a lot in these games. And I feel like the developers are also to blame because I think there are interviews they've done where they've encouraged people to do knife-only and just make their games very simple and very basic and pretty silly to watch. Like, that amount of peer pressure just leads you to believe that you're playing the game wrong and that you have to do the games knife only, otherwise you're not going to get the experience the developers want, or that the experience that is now shaped by the number of people using the knife in these games. And unfortunately, those people don't understand the consequences of designing a game around knife only. Not only do you force the developers to make everything so simplistically designed, but you also take away any level of creativity from a lot of these encounters and like the different scenario designs or anything like that. Like, the knife just doesn't stand out as a tool whatsoever. It stands out a lot more in games that are designed for all the weapons in mind, like Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil 7. I mean, admittedly, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 OG, they are designed for all the weapons in mind, because there are situations that are really bad if you don't have certain weapons. But with the number of people in the fan base that have just done knife-only runs, and then they're trying to influence the opinions of others to make the games seem like they're designed for knife-only, it creates this nagging sensation within you that's like, oh, you should do it knife only, or just look at these scenarios like you're supposed to do them with just the knife, or if not with just the knife, then with the handgun and the knife, which is why you saw me doing a lot of the RPD without really using the grenade launcher. I mean, I did use it in certain parts just to speed up the sections, but you know, I could have used the grenade launcher to get rid of a lot of the zombies, but, you know, that nagging sensation generated by the fact that I've seen too many people, like, play this game knife only, or with how a lot of popular streamers try to glamorize knife only like it's some impressive thing in Resident Evil 2 OG, it just made me step back for a second and just be like, oh, you know what, I'll just do this with just the pistol and the knife, and just really showcase how dull this game can be at times. And also a part of that is due to the inventory, because the lack of inventory space in these older Resident Evil titles can often force you down that route to favor a very limited playstyle, just so you're having to optimize your route and spending as little time as possible in the inventory, because, you know, spending time in the inventory menu can be a really tedious process, and you're less likely to put yourself in a situation where you're forced to go back to the item box to deposit an item that's taking up space if you just favor that limited playstyle. That's one of the secondary consequences of making the inventory system the way it is in these older Resident Evil titles. But as you can see, we're in the lab, and we've already triggered the self-destruct sequence, so we need to get out of here and save Sherry. It's honestly crazy how Wary the Rook in her review of Resident Evil 2 Remake, while it was a great review and she did help me better appreciate Resident Evil 2 OG story and characters on a better level, I'm just surprised that she called the lab and the sewer section in Resident Evil 2 Remake lacking compared to Resident Evil 2 OG when you barely spend any time in these areas. And also, Wary the Rook was incorrect when she said that the lab in Resident Evil 2 OG was located in the sewers beneath Raccoon City. I talked with the Resident Evil podcast team 10 days ago, and they said this lab is actually located in the industrial zone in the outskirts of Raccoon City. And you know something else that's crazy? You know that area where I fought G2 Birkin? That's the same area you go to as Rebecca in Resident Evil 0 when she reunites with Enrico. That right there is both crazy, but at the same time really confusing, because it just plays out like a coincidence that Rebecca and Enrico were literally in the lab where the G-Virus was being developed. The same lab that Leon, Claire, and Ada would go to in Resident Evil 2 OG 2 months after the events of Resident Evil 1. So Rebecca and Enrico literally missed out on the chance to destroy the G-Virus in July of 1998, and then it would take Chris until August to realize the existence of the G-Virus, which would be odd if Rebecca was technically in that lab. And the reason why this area exists in Resident Evil 0, as described by the Resident Evil podcast team, is because it was added at the last minute to expand the game, which is why you won't find any concept art for that area in Resident Evil 0. That's definitely something I need to point out in my Resident Evil 2 Remake retrospective, but we're making our way over the G4 Birkin, who is the worst boss of Resident Evil 2 OG, as I've already described, and this exploit I'm going to use against him is needed. He is so broken, he's so badly designed. He was designed by by morons at outdated Capcom, as I'm going to call this team that designed the older Resident Evil titles. And the fight begins now. So he's in his G3 form, and this is very simple. You just gotta shoot him 12 times, but the last shot has to be when he's standing in a specific area. So from this spot, you can fire them 5 times, and then right here, you can get some shots in, but I pulled up my aim too early, so the auto aim didn't work in my favor. So I'm just gonna go to this corner right here, and I'm gonna shoot him 5 times again. Once that's done, I need to go to the next corner and make sure that Birkin is in the center path before I deal the last shot that transforms him into G4 Birkin. And I don't know why, but Claire auto-aimed onto G3 Birkin even though my shots aren't even landing on him. So I need to adjust for this, and this is the last shot right here. So he's transforming. So normally when he transforms, he'll try to attack you, but when you put him in that spot, he'll always miss you. And then as soon as he's done the attack, he'll jump up here, and then this is where the exploit is being shown. So keeping Birkin on the top level is an important part of this strategy. So what I need to do is shoot him twice, and then after the second shot, I need to immediately walk back to the center part of that railing, so that when Birkin attacks, he will not try to jump down to attack me. He will instead try to do the attack on the top level, because he's getting my position confused. So right here, he did the attack, so I'm going to back up, shoot him twice, and then move back to the center part of the railing, and he's going to attack, but he's not going to come down because he's going to be stuck up there. And you just repeat this process over and over again until he dies. Be very careful that you don't go to the left corner of this railing, because if he attacks and he lands like slightly above you, he can actually grab you with phantom range, and I have it as a blooper at the final part of this video. G4 Birkin is that broken, he's able to grab you with phantom range. That is seriously stupid. And when he grabs you through this broken manner, he's able to put you in the air permanently. You are literally stuck in the air the entire time, but your hitbox is still on the ground level, which is why he's still able to hit you even though you're technically flying above him. This is one of the most rushed boss fights ever in the entire Resident Evil series, and yet people want to say, oh, Resident Evil 2 OG didn't need a remake. It did need a remake if it's favoring this level of stupidity with a boss like this. At least G4 Birkin was fixed in Resident Evil 2 Remake, so it actually feels like a finished boss fight compared to what it's like here, where the developers just rushed this boss out the door. And that is the end of Claire A, and now we have a couple of bloopers here. So this is one of those random moments where a zombie lunges for your leg. It doesn't really do that much damage, but it's still really stupid how they get full-on iframes when they do that stupid move out of nowhere, when you're trying to aim and hit them. And then this right here, look at this, look at this. This is the phantom range on the grab. There is no reason for G4 Birkin to grab me like this, and now I'm just stuck in the air. I can still hit him, but unfortunately, he's gonna still be able to hit me because my hitbox is still on the ground level. What a completely retarded encounter. So fucking broken that that kind of shit happens. Do not give any respect to this piece of shit boss fight, but stay tuned for the future walkthroughs of the other scenarios of Resident Evil 2 OG. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.